Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Lewis, for 5 minutes.
I would thank the chair and welcome Director Mulvaney. Glad to have you back in the Budget Committee. Let me start with a couple of quick questions and a short yes or no answer on a couple of these things, and then we'll get into a more substantive give and take a little bit. It's interesting to note, especially from the other side, that the first balanced budget in over 8 years, or in 8 years, has been greeted by moral outrage. Shockingly extreme, I think is the phrase I heard. Do you find it shockingly extreme that our gone from 10.6 trillion to 19.9 trillion in just the last 8 years?
I absolutely do.
Do you find it shockingly extreme that we're mired in 1.9% growth over the next 10 years?
Frustratingly so, yes, sir.
Do you find it shockingly extreme that we've had record tax revenue last year, over $3.2 trillion, and yet we have a $600 billion deficit this year?
It's unacceptable.
Shockingly extreme that net interest expense is projected to be $768 billion, but if interest rates go back to their post-World War II average 10-year Treasury at 5.7%, it'll be well over $1 trillion.
We'll be broke.
It's shockingly extreme that the federal budget outlays has gone from $1 trillion in 1987 to $2 trillion in 2002 to $4 trillion today.
Growing much faster than every other measure of economic output.
Is it still shockingly extreme that federal revenue is above its 50-year average of 17.4% of GDP? Now it's at 17.8% of GDP, and yet we're told it's not enough?
It's never enough, is it?
Shockingly extreme that federal outlays are above their 50-year average of GDP, 20.3%, today at 21%, scheduled to go to 23.4% of GDP.
Just unacceptable.
Federal debt held by the public, 77% of GDP, but actually total federal debt is almost 100% of GDP, correct? Is that shockingly extreme?
And going to have long-term detrimental economic impact on our economy.
And the civilian labor force participation rate back to 1977 levels at 62.8%?
But even lower than it should be given the graying of the American workforce population.
And finally, is it shockingly extreme that the top 25% of taxpayers, those households making $78,000 a year or more, 2 teachers making $40,000 a year, actually pay 87% of all income taxes collected?
Yeah, that's where the money is, right?
So in spite of all of the debt, all of the spending, all of the Keynesian stimulus, we are stuck at 1.9% growth. The CBO says it's going to be 1.9% growth in 10 years. And I'm wondering why that is, if that's all supposed to be so stimulative, and we're going to have the multiplier effect and demand-side economics is going to pull us out of this. Isn't the President's budget and what you're defending today an attempt to make certain that we grow at historical averages by not focusing on this pumping up or priming of demand, but getting investment and productivity back in the economy?
Private investment is what's going to save the country, because that is where innovation comes from, that's where productivity comes from, and that's where GDP growth comes from. We've tried it the other way. We've tried it with huge federal spending for the last 30 years. And now here we are where a large portion of the population, a large portion of this body, thinks that 1.9% is the best we are going to ever be able to do. And that bespeaks a pessimism about the country that we simply refuse to accept.
And we've heard this notion of malaise. We're stuck in slow growth. We just can't move. Jimmy Carter talked about malaise. And yet we had 5 consecutive quarters after the pro-growth policies in the early 80s of 7% growth. Where's the empirical evidence that we can't grow at 3.5%?
No, I think the empirical evidence is that we can grow at 3%.
So the emphasis of this budget is to say we've got the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world at 35%. We've got $2.6 trillion in profits that could be repatriated. We've got a pass-through tax rate. Subchapter S, LLC, small businessman or woman, paying not 39.6%, but 43, 44% when you take out the PEP and Ps and the itemized deductions. Lowering those tax rates is going to provide more capital, which is going to increase productivity. The truck driver, is it not true, Director Mulvaney, is always more productive with the truck?
Always.
And therefore, that's what this budget is supposed to do. And we've got data to show it's been done in the past, in the 60s, in the 80s, and even in the 90s.
Not only that, we need to do it to save the country.
In fact, without this sort of and this investment in productivity, we'll never balance the budget.
No, sir. Well, I take that back. At some point, we will balance the budget. The question is, do we do it on our terms or on someone else's? Because at some point, people will start to refuse to lend us money. And I'd much rather do it on our terms than somebody else's.
Thank you, Director Mulvaney. Good to see you again, and I yield